Welcome to the Siege Archive, where empires fall and legends rise. On a bright morning in July 1879, on a wide grassy plain in southern Africa, two of the most unlikely opponents in the history of warfare prepared to face each other for the last time. On one side stood a kingdom that had ruled the region for more than half a century. The Zulu nation, a society built around discipline, courage, and one of the most feared infantry armies the African continent had ever produced. Their warriors numbered close to 50,000 at full strength. They fought with short stabbing spears, rawhide shields, and tactics refined over generations of warfare. They had crushed every neighbor who had ever tried to challenge them. On the other side stood a force of about 4,000 British soldiers, far from home, weakened by months of brutal campaigning, and led by a general whose reputation had already been shattered by one of the worst military disasters in British history. By the numbers, this should have been a slaughter. By the geography, it should have ended in another Zulu victory. And yet, within a few short hours on that grassy plain, the entire balance of southern Africa would be overturned. A kingdom that had stood for 60 years would be brought to the edge of collapse. A king would lose his crown. And the British Empire would once again prove that war in the 19th century was no longer decided by numbers, by terrain, or even by courage. It was decided by something far more brutal. To understand how 4,000 men could break the back of an army more than 10 times their size, you have to go back several months, to the beginning of a war that the British had started, lost, and very nearly been driven out of altogether. In the early months of 1879, the British colonial government in southern Africa had decided that the independent Zulu kingdom must be brought under imperial control. The reasons were political, economic, and personal, driven by colonial administrators who wanted a unified, obedient territory under British rule. The Zulu king, Cetshwayo, was given an impossible ultimatum designed to be refused. When he refused it, the war began. The British plan was confident, almost arrogant. 3 columns of troops would invade the Zulu kingdom from different directions, converge on the royal capital at Ulundi, and force a quick surrender. The man in command was Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford, a respected officer who believed the campaign would be over in weeks. He had never fought an enemy like the Zulu before. Within days, that belief would be destroyed. On the morning of January 22, 1879, while Chelmsford was away from his main camp searching for the Zulu army found his camp instead. The site was a place called Isandlwana, a tall rocky hill rising above the plain. The British force there numbered around 1,500 men, well armed with modern Martini Henry rifles, supported by artillery. They were attacked by roughly 20,000 Zulu warriors. The battle lasted only a few hours. The Zulu used a formation known as the Horns of the Buffalo, a tactic in which fast-moving wings encircled the enemy while the strong central body crushed them head-on. The British line, stretched too thin and slow to react, was overrun. By the time the sun set on Isandlwana, more than 1,300 British and Allied troops lay dead. It was one of the worst defeats ever inflicted on a European army by an indigenous African force. News of the disaster shocked London. Newspapers questioned the competence of the army. Politicians demanded answers. And in southern Africa, Chelmsford was now a general fighting not only the Zulu, but the ruin of his own reputation. The British response was massive. Reinforcements were poured into the region. New regiments, fresh artillery, additional cavalry, supply trains, and engineering units were shipped from across the empire. The campaign that had been expected to last a few weeks now had to be restarted from scratch. For months, Chelmsford rebuilt his army, learned from the mistakes of Isandlwana, and prepared for a final decisive march on Ulundi. He had to redeem himself before a replacement general arrived to take command. He moved cautiously this time. His columns advanced slowly, building fortified camps each night, refusing to be caught in the open the way his men had been in January. Patrols stayed close. Scouts watched constantly for signs of ambush. By late June, his force had pushed deep into the heart of the Zulu kingdom and was approaching the great royal capital of Ulundi itself. King Cetshwayo, watching the slow advance, tried repeatedly to negotiate. He sent envoys with cattle, with ivory, with offers of peace. Chelmsford refused every offer. He had not come this far to accept a truce. He had come for a battle that would end the war on his terms. By the morning of July 4, 1879, the British force, numbering roughly 4,000 infantry, cavalry, and artillery, marched out from their fortified camp and advanced into the open plain near Ulundi. They left their wagons behind. They carried only what they needed for a single day of combat, and waiting for them in the surrounding hills was the Zulu army. Estimates of its size that day range from 15,000 to over 20,000 warriors, the bulk of the kingdom's remaining fighting strength, supported by reserves that brought the total Zulu force in the region close to its full national army of nearly 50,000 men. What Chelmsford did next would become one of the most studied formations in colonial military history. Instead of advancing in lines, columns, or any traditional European battle order, he ordered his entire force into a single, massive hollow square. The infantry formed the four sides, standing shoulder to shoulder, 4 ranks deep. Inside the square were the artillery, the cavalry, the wounded, the supplies, and the command staff. The Gatling guns, early rapid-fire weapons capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, were placed at the corners. From the air, the formation would have looked like a slow-moving fortress, made entirely of men and metal, walking across the African plain. The Zulu had broken square formations before. They had overrun much larger British detachments at Isandlwana. But the difference at Ulundi was preparation. Every soldier in that square had practiced this position for months. Every officer knew exactly where his unit would stand. Every rifle had been cleaned and loaded. Every ammunition box had been placed within easy reach. The mistakes that had cost the British so dearly at Isandlwana, scattered lines, isolated companies, ammunition stored too far behind the firing line, had been studied, analyzed, and corrected. As the square reached open ground, the Zulu attack began. Tens of thousands of warriors rose from the surrounding hills and charged across the plain in the same disciplined formation that had destroyed the British 6 months earlier. The horns of the buffalo swept outward to encircle the square. The center pushed forward with terrifying speed. To the men inside the formation, watching the wave of warriors close in, it must have seemed impossible that any wall of soldiers could withstand what was coming. But the technology of 1879 was not the technology of earlier wars. The Martini Henry rifle could fire accurately at a range of more than 400 meters. A trained soldier could load and fire 10 or more rounds per minute. The Gatling guns at the corners poured streams of bullets into the advancing Zulu ranks. Artillery shells exploded among the charging warriors, tearing gaps in their formations long before they could reach the British line. The Zulu warriors carried short stabbing spears designed for close combat. To use them, they had to cross hundreds of meters of open ground under continuous fire. They had no cover. They had no equivalent firepower. Many of them carried older muskets and rifles captured in earlier battles, but they lacked the ammunition, training, and tactics to use them effectively. They came on bravely, wave after wave, but the ground in front of the British square began to fill with their dead. The horns of the buffalo, which had encircled and crushed the British at Isandlwana, could not close around a position that fired in every direction at once. The center, which had broken so many enemies before, could not push through a wall of rifles that never stopped reloading. After roughly half an hour of intense combat, the Zulu attack began to falter. The closest warriors had reached within 40 meters of the British line. Some had reached even closer. None had broken through. As the assault began to slow, Chelmsford ordered his cavalry to charge out from inside the square. The 17th Lancers, supported by mounted infantry, swept out across the plain and pursued the retreating Zulu warriors. The Battle of Ulundi, the last great battle of the Anglo-Zulu War, was effectively over within an hour. The casualty figures from that day revealed the true nature of the conflict. The British lost roughly 10 men killed and about 70 wounded. Zulu losses were estimated between 1,500 and 2,000 dead, with many more wounded. The kingdom that had crushed an entire British column 6 months earlier had been broken in a single morning. King Cetshwayo fled into the hills as British troops marched into Ulundi and burned the royal capital to the ground. He was captured a few weeks later and sent into exile. The independent Zulu kingdom, which had stood for 60 years as one of the most powerful states in southern Africa, ceased to exist. Its territory was divided among smaller chiefs, then absorbed piece by piece into the expanding British colonial empire. The story of Ulundi has often been told as a triumph of European discipline and technology over African warfare. But the deeper lesson is something more uncomfortable. The Zulu warriors who charged the British square that day were not poorly trained. They were not poorly led. They were among the bravest and most disciplined soldiers of their century. What they lacked was not courage. It was firepower. The gap between a stabbing spear and a Martini Henry rifle was a gap of 2,000 years of weapons development, compressed into a single battlefield. No amount of bravery could close it. The Anglo-Zulu War had begun with one of the worst defeats in British colonial history and ended with the destruction of an entire kingdom. 4,000 men had defeated an army more than 10 times their size, not because they were braver, not because they were better soldiers, but because they had carried with them the deadliest weapons of their age. And in the silence that followed the smoke of Ulundi, an old world of warriors with spears and shields quietly came to an end, replaced by a new and far more terrible kind of war.